The roar of the engines echoed dully through the thick windows of the portholes. Keanu Reeves sat by the window in the first class of a luxurious private jet, dressed in a simple black hoodie, worn-out jeans, and old sneakers. He was nearly invisible against the backdrop of gleaming diamonds and silk that adorned the other passengers. Most of them were successful businessmen, influential investors, stars with bodyguards and sparkling outfits. Next to them, Keanu looked out of place. The steward, named John, young and clearly ambitious, was scanning the boarding list when his gaze stopped at Keanu. He pursed his lips disapprovingly and walked over. "Excuse me, sir, are you sure you're in the right seat?" His voice carried a hint of annoyance. "First class requires a certain level." Keanu tore his eyes away from the book he was holding. His eyes were calm, almost warm, but he didn't rush to answer. "This is seat 1A, right?" The steward frowned slightly. "Seems so, but—" "Then everything is fine," Keanu said softly, yet firmly, and returned his gaze to the page. John didn't back down. He gave the passenger a quick once-over, stopping at the worn sneakers. Nearby, passengers began to take notice. Someone giggled quietly. Someone took a photo. "If you need help with appropriate attire or anything else, feel free to ask." "We have a dress code for the lounge," the steward muttered, turning away, throwing a glance full of contempt. Keanu continued reading. His face didn't change one bit. He knew this wasn't the first time scenes like this had happened. He never wore designer suits for planes. There were other things that mattered to him, but this time, it was different. Keanu felt the tension rising in the cabin, the looks falling on him like stones. But he remained calm, absorbed in the lines of his book. He knew the moment hadn't come yet, but soon everything would change. The steward, a tall man with impeccably pressed clothes, well-groomed hands, and a cold stare, walked down the first-class aisle with perfect posture. His gaze slid over the passengers with a look of almost invisible disdain, the kind of look waiters give unwelcome guests at an expensive restaurant. When he noticed Keanu, his eyebrows raised just slightly, but that was enough for him to pass judgment. "Can I help you with something?" he asked with a slight sneer, noticing that Keanu hadn't ordered anything special like the other passengers. Keanu, in his usual gray hoodie, jeans, and worn-out sneakers, politely shook his head. "Everything's fine, thank you." A few minutes later, the steward returned to the service area. His colleague, a woman with perfectly styled hair, noticed his annoyed expression. "Something wrong?" she asked quietly. "Did you see that guy in 3A? Dressed like he's from economy class. And his seat's in first class. Looks like someone won a lottery ticket," he said, not holding back. They both laughed. Behind them stood passengers in designer suits with gold watches and expensive jewelry. But one of them suddenly looked curiously at Keanu. The face seemed vaguely familiar. Keanu continued reading his book. He could already feel the eyes on him, not just with curiosity but with judgment. On a plane where every detail spoke of status, his appearance didn't fit the usual picture, but he wasn't trying to prove anything. Every time the steward walked by, it seemed like he was looking for a reason to say something sarcastic. First, he accidentally bumped the seat with his trolley. Then he handed the water a bit more sharply than necessary. Keanu remained calm. After the third hour of flight, the steward came back to distribute the meals. After serving all the passengers, he abruptly stopped at Keanu's seat. "Excuse me, but special requests are made in advance. I assume you didn't know that?" "I didn't order anything. Thank you," Keanu replied calmly. The passenger sitting next to him, a large man in a business suit, turned and said, "Strange. I thought it was Keanu Reeves. Doesn't it look like him?" The steward smirked. "Of course. And I'm Tom Cruise." At that moment, a quiet laugh rippled through the cabin, but one of the passengers pulled out their phone, quickly typed something, and held the screen up to the steward. "Look at this. Isn't it him?" The steward looked at the screen and froze. Before him was a photo of Keanu Reeves, with the same eyes, the same light stubble, the same book in his hands. He paled. The smile disappeared. He nodded silently and, avoiding eye contact, quickly walked away. The cabin froze. Some passengers turned in surprise, while others began to whisper. Keanu looked up at the man next to him and quietly said, "Thank you." The man merely nodded. But it was clear he wasn't just surprised, he was stunned. Rumors spread quickly in first class. Passengers began to whisper, "Is it really him? I thought he only flew on private jets. He's so simple, yet at the same time." Keanu felt the change, but he continued reading. He wasn't planning to make a scene or take advantage of the moment. His face remained calm, his gaze focused. He was at peace with himself, and in that lay his strength. Half an hour later, the steward reappeared. In his hands was a tray with the dish typically served only to premium guests. He approached Keanu and lowered his head. "I apologize for my rudeness. Please accept this from us." Keanu looked at him, smiled slightly, and nodded. "It's all right." The steward left, not looking back. He no longer whispered, no longer mocked, and Keanu went back to reading. As though nothing had happened, Keanu sat in his luxurious seat, gazing at the clouds when his attention was drawn to strange sounds. Light footsteps, rustling clothing, and, suddenly, a fleeting figure among the passengers. The steward, who had previously been quite friendly, now kept his distance, his face tense. Keanu watched closely, noticing how the attendant was eyeing him warily. All these signs hinted that something was off. Suddenly, the steward made his way toward Keanu. His stride was confident, but every step felt like something was being concealed. Keanu opened his book again, pretending not to notice the approach. However, inside, his heart began to race. He knew something was happening. "Excuse me, sir, do you know you're not supposed to be here?" the steward said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, carefully studying Keanu. Those words were like a knife to the back. Keanu felt his breath slow, his muscles tensing. He lifted his gaze and the steward remained standing, not breaking eye contact. Not hiding his surprise, Keanu spoke quietly but confidently. "Actually, I think you've recognized me." He waited a few seconds, allowing the words to have the intended effect. The man froze, his face paling and his eyes widened in shock. Keanu, not waiting for a response, pulled out his passport and opened it, revealing his identity. The steward stood motionless, unable to utter a word. "You, Keanu Reeves?" the steward said, his voice trembling. He immediately stepped back, gripping the seat. Keanu didn't change his expression, continuing to sit calmly. "Yes, that's me." A slight smile on his face confirmed that he was more than calm in this situation. The steward, who had just shown aggression, now silently stepped aside. His body tensed with embarrassment and awkwardness, and he quickly left, too afraid to look at Keanu again. Meanwhile, a few passengers who had overheard the conversation began exchanging glances, whispering quietly among themselves. "Keanu Reeves, on our plane," they whispered, trying to comprehend what had just happened. A few minutes later, the steward returned, walked past Keanu again, and, with undeniable shame, informed him that he would do everything possible to ensure that this situation wouldn't happen again. Keanu, not burdening him with questions, nodded. He knew there was no point in continuing the conversation. However, questions started forming in his mind. While the steward disappeared around the corner, Keanu couldn't help but wonder. Why had his identity triggered such a reaction? Was it just one isolated incident, or had someone been watching him? Keanu stood, walked over to the window, and gazed into the void. He felt something elusive in the air. Perhaps this wasn't just a random incident, but the beginning of something much bigger. His intuition had never failed him, and now it was telling him that this incident might have been the first step toward a major and important discovery. So he decided it was time to take the next step. Turning, Keanu saw another steward approaching him. This was the same man who had initially seemed displeased and dismissive. Now he stood next to Keanu, and despite his invisible anxiety, his voice was soft. "Apologies for the misunderstanding, Mr. Reeves. We certainly didn't expect," the steward began, but Keanu immediately interrupted him. "No need for apologies," Keanu said, looking straight into the steward's eyes. "Is there something else you'd like to tell me?" The man paused as if considering and suddenly said, "You need to understand that this flight is different from the others, and what you've noticed is not a coincidence." "What does that mean?" Keanu asked sharply. The steward looked at him with concern, and then, realizing that it would be too late to speak up later, lowered his head. "There are things down there that we can't control." "What things?" Keanu asked, his heart racing. The steward simply looked at him silently and stepped aside, leaving Keanu in confusion. The feeling was such that everything around him seemed to no longer be the same as it had been. Now Keanu was standing before something much greater than just a misunderstanding. A feeling of unease and curiosity flared inside him. He knew that, at this moment, he was on the verge of uncovering something important and dangerous. With every step, he was getting closer to the answer. Keanu stood by the window, staring at the endless blue sky stretching before him. His mind was far from the empty clouds. He knew that what had just happened with this steward was no coincidence, and now he had the sense that this flight was not as ordinary as it had seemed at first. He couldn't shake the thought that something was hidden beneath the surface, and his curiosity had been sparked. Why had the steward reacted the way he did to his presence? Why had that moment, when he revealed his identity, had such an effect? It wasn't long before Keanu felt like someone was watching him. He caught a glimpse of a familiar figure moving down the aisle. The steward, who had been so ready to leave moments ago, was now back in view. His movements were slow and deliberate, but his eyes seemed to be searching for something. Or someone. Keanu turned, knowing that this situation wasn't as simple as it appeared. He knew that his encounter with this steward was just the beginning. The steward approached, and his face became unexpectedly serious. Keanu noticed how his gaze dropped to the floor before he took a deep breath. "Mr. Reeves," the steward began, his voice soft but clear. "I need to tell you something. Something that concerns not just you, but this entire flight." Keanu listened carefully, his heart starting to race. The steward glanced around as if worried that someone might overhear. This was the moment when the entire atmosphere aboard the plane seemed to tense up. The steward slowed his pace and paused, making sure no one could hear their conversation. "You should know that this flight wasn't random. This plane isn't just flying," the steward said. "There's much more behind it than you think." Keanu frowned. He could feel the conversation starting to take on a different tone. Every word the steward spoke felt like a small stone landing in his mind, forcing him to analyze it. What are you trying to say?" he asked, peering into the steward's eyes. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at him with a kind of sorrow and muttered, "You see, you're not just a passenger right now, and you're not just an actor. You're a part of what's happening on board. We're all not just here by chance." Keanu felt his mind fill with even more anxiety. He was trying to figure out what was being said, but the steward's words were not giving him clear answers. He looked up at the steward's face and noticed that the man seemed to be in confusion again. "This isn't what you think," the steward said, his voice wavering. But he continued, "There are forces controlling this. This is bigger than you think. They're watching you, Mr. Reeves." Keanu wanted to ask a question, but the steward quickly stepped back and turned towards the exit. "Ask questions later, if you wish," he said, and without waiting for an answer, he left. Keanu's mind was buzzing with countless questions, but he understood that the steward was not ready to reveal more. Still, Keanu knew this situation was starting to take shape as a much more complex story than he had imagined. Now he sat, trying to process all the information he had just heard. The shadows of suspicion were becoming clearer, just as the many little oddities he had noticed during the flight began to add up. Why had his identity affected the steward so much? Why was this plane connected to something bigger? Keanu stood and walked back to his seat. His hands were slightly trembling from the tension. He knew that all these signs weren't random. He felt that he was at the very center of something grand, yet hidden from most. Now was not the time for doubt. Everything pointed to the fact that he was drawn into something far more dangerous. Keanu decided to act. He couldn't just sit idly by. No matter what he had gone through, he felt he had to keep searching for answers. He walked to the window and looked out at the sky, which seemed invisible. In his mind, one thought kept circling. If there were hidden manipulations taking place here, if something bigger than just a simple flight was concealed, how far was he willing to go to uncover the truth? Keanu sat back in his seat, almost motionless, his entire focus on the steward's last words. "Ask questions later if you want." These words echoed in his mind. He realized that all this time he had been on board not just a plane, but something far more dangerous and complicated. He glanced again at the gray ocean of clouds outside the window, as if the sky were predicting what he was about to uncover. But what did all of this mean? Why had the steward given him that hint? Keanu was certain that his identity had hardly attracted attention by accident. This was something more significant. He sighed and looked at his conversation partner, who had disappeared down the aisle. Before his thoughts were consumed by inner doubts, he noticed that several other stewards were watching him intently. They were silent, not approaching him, and they ignored his presence. This moment seemed decisive. Something was wrong with this flight, Keanu thought. He couldn't leave it unattended. Running his fingers over the cover of his book, he realized he couldn't continue reading until he figured this out. He stood up, grabbed his bag, and headed toward the back of the plane. Walking through the aisle was uncomfortable, but the oppressive atmosphere that lingered unsettled him. On his way to the rear cabins, he managed to notice a few familiar faces among the passengers. They noticeably avoided his gaze. Keanu felt something strange was hidden behind these actions. Why were they like this? Why were people acting so strangely? He was sure this flight had become something much more important to him than just another trip to a new city. Suddenly, he heard footsteps and turned his head. It was one of the stewards. A young man glanced at him from the side and walked closer. His eyes were anxious, as if something was whispering to him, urging him to do something important. "Mr. Reeves," he said quietly, "may I speak with you?" Keanu raised an eyebrow but decided to listen to him. "Of course, what's troubling you?" he replied calmly. The steward, turning, gestured for Keanu to follow him through the door. It was a special door located at the back of the plane, leading to small crew quarters. Keanu felt the tension rise as they stopped by the door, and the steward signaled for no one to overhear them. "I know you've noticed something strange," the steward began, "and it's connected to this flight. Please trust me when I say it's not what it seems." Keanu listened intently. He couldn't quite figure out where this was leading. "We're watching you," the steward continued, nervously looking around, "and you need to be careful." Keanu couldn't understand what he meant, but one thing was clear. This situation was becoming increasingly complicated. "Watching?" Keanu asked, confused. "Who? Why?" The steward raised his hands as if to explain himself. "Believe me, I can't say everything. But you have to understand, we're involved in something much more serious. This flight, it's not just a regular flight." Keanu stood in the shadows of the small room, tension thick in the air. His mind raced, trying to piece everything together. This flight, these stewards, All of this was far more than just a random coincidence. He felt that their conversation wasn't just a warning. It was the beginning of something bigger. "How are you involved?" Keanu asked, his voice becoming firm and confident. The steward sighed and, sensing the pressure, leaned closer to Keanu, as if to hide his words from the others. "We're not just crew," he whispered. "We're part of a program. We have a mission. And you, Mr. Reeves, are not a coincidence. You were chosen, and this is not just a flight." Keanu stared at him, stunned. He felt his nerves tighten. What did he mean? Why had they chosen him? Questions multiplied in his mind, and the answers remained elusive. But he felt that the situation was growing more dangerous. Time seemed to slow down, and every moment became more tense. The steward's words struck Keanu like lightning. He knew this wasn't just a coincidence. But what now? What was he supposed to do? He realized he couldn't just give up and ignore this. The situation required action, but what exactly? What steps should he take next? Who were these people? Why had they chosen him? Keanu raised his eyes again and looked at the steward's face. His eyes were genuine, filled with concern. In that moment, Keanu understood that perhaps he would have to find the answers himself. He stepped toward the door, glancing up at the steward. "It seems like this isn't accidental," Keanu said, firmly deciding that he would continue to seek answers, "and I'm not going to back down." Keanu remained in that small room with the door shut, feeling as though everything he had known until now was starting to unravel. His thoughts were spinning. He couldn't understand why he had been chosen for this flight, but now it seemed he had no other choice but to follow what had begun. The steward looked at him with an unreadable expression, but Keanu saw the determination in his eyes. They both knew the situation was growing more dangerous, and every step now could be decisive. "I have to go," Keanu said, holding himself back from losing control. "What's next? Who are you?" The steward looked into his eyes for a few seconds, as if pondering whether to continue. But then he nodded, as though making a decision. "Mr. Reeves," the steward began, his voice trembling quietly, We're watching you, not just on this flight. You've become a target, and this is not just a coincidence. We work for people who want to know what you're capable of." Keanu stood silently, trying to process this information. He realized that every action and decision now carried weight, and something told him that this was not just a game. He was being manipulated, and he could feel the mechanism pulling him into its web. After those words, the steward stood up and walked towards the door, checking to see if anyone could see them. Keanu felt his heart begin to race. He was on the brink of understanding something bigger. The steward turned back to him. "Before you leave," he said, "I need to tell you something important. But remember, if you choose to go further, there will be no turning back. This is not as simple as it seems." Keanu nodded, bracing himself for a shocking revelation, unaware that the truth that would change his entire perception was about to unfold. The steward turned and whispered, "You've been part of an experiment. Your choices, your way of life. It's not just a coincidence. The people you're connected with want to understand the decisions you'll make and how your actions will affect the course of events. This flight is just the beginning." Keanu felt as if his entire life was shifting into a completely different reality. He was part of something he hadn't even suspected. After those words, the steward quickly left the room, leaving Keanu alone with his thoughts. This conversation made him feel as though everything he knew was dissolving into mist. Who was behind all of this? Why had they chosen him? And what was he supposed to do with this newfound knowledge? Keanu understood that he couldn't just ignore this conversation and return to his normal life. He had been pulled into this game, and now he needed to find the answers. There was no time for hesitation. He turned and returned to his seat in the cabin. But his calmness was gone. His eyes searched the people around him, trying to understand who among the passengers could be part of what was going on. His mind was in constant turmoil. He had to act. But what would his next step be? He couldn't allow this web to trap him further. Throughout the rest of the flight, Keanu couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Looking at the faces of the passengers now felt different to him. Everyone he saw seemed to be a part of this secret game, and no one knew how it would end. When the plane landed and passengers began disembarking, Keanu felt his determination growing. He had to get answers. But how? He stepped off the plane, watching the people around him, trying to discern something familiar from their faces. This was not just a game, this was a real fight, and his role was much more important than he could have ever imagined. But just before he was about to enter the waiting area, one of the stewards stopped him. It was the same young man he had spoken to earlier. The steward grabbed him by the sleeve and whispered, "Don't leave. We have more information for you, but be prepared. You're about to learn a lot of things you didn't suspect." Keanu paused, sighed, and agreed. This was the beginning of his journey, and now he had to find out who was behind all of this. Keanu could feel the tension rising with every step he took. The conversation with the steward from yesterday still haunted him, but he knew it was time to act. He observed everyone around him, studying their faces, every movement, trying to understand who might be connected to this conspiracy. However, the more he thought, the less clear it became. What was this mysterious society that was watching his every move? And what did the strange phrase from the steward mean? "If you choose to go further, there will be no turning back." He reached the edge of the terminal and stopped, looking around. The tension in the air was becoming more palpable. Keanu felt that someone was watching him. He wasn't a paranoid person, but the feeling was too strong to ignore. And then, as if in response to his thoughts, his gaze caught a person standing nearby, watching him intently. "No one told me it would be like this," Keanu whispered to himself, trying to find some way out. Suddenly, his gaze landed on an old information board displaying the latest flights and schedules. Keanu felt something tighten inside him, and he realized that this could be the key. He remembered everything the steward had told him, about the connection to his past, about the organization he was now part of. He decided to return to the airport. The path to the truth lay here, among these meaningless flight numbers and people he had never known but who, as it turned out, he was about to meet. When he returned to the check-in desk, the steward was there. They exchanged glances but didn't speak a word. Instead, the steward moved toward him and took a step closer. "Have you decided to continue?" the steward asked, slightly nervous. Keanu nodded. "I need to know what's going on. Who are you all?" The steward looked him in the eye but remained silent. The silence spoke more than words. Keanu felt that time was not on his side. His internal conflict grew stronger. He didn't know what to do, but his intuition told him that continuing was the only option. He tore his gaze away from the steward and looked around. At that moment, his eyes met a woman standing at the other end of the hall. She was not the type of person he expected to meet here. Her calmness and confidence in her eyes made him feel that she might be part of the solution. She stepped toward him, sat down beside him without saying a word. "You're not alone, Keanu," she said, calmly and confidently. "I know what you're looking for, and I can help." These words made him freeze. He didn't know how she could know his name, but a new sense of hope started to grow inside him. The woman, as if sensing his doubts, continued, "You've been chosen, and what you've started, this is not just a coincidence. Your involvement in this project, it's not just a chance." He felt how each of her answers brought him closer to the truth. He asked questions, but she only responded with what he needed to keep moving forward. Keanu was now sure that this woman knew everything that needed to be known. She explained that the group of people he was connected with had been watching his actions for a long time. Everything that had happened in his life recently was part of a much grander plan. "You're on the right path, but now you need to decide if you're ready to go through all of this," she said. "They won't wait. You've aimed for the truth, and now you've become part of this game. They won't let you go." He didn't respond, but his gaze became firm. He knew now that he had to move forward, despite the fear and uncertainty. This was much bigger than he had thought. He couldn't stop now. And then came the moment when Keanu had to make a decision. Everything he had known led him to this moment, and what he saw before him made him stop. He understood that his actions could now change not just his life, but the lives of others. He had met people he hadn't even known about, and he was standing on the verge of uncovering everything that had been hidden for decades. These people were playing the game, and now he had to play his part. "If you're ready, you can know the truth," the woman said, handing him the information. Keanu knew that this moment wasn't just a chance. It was his chance for salvation. He couldn't turn back. When Keanu opened the folder with the documents the woman had given him, all the secrets started to unfold. He saw information that no one could ever believe. This was information that could change the course of history. Every word, every line seemed important. Everything he had thought about and done now made sense. His life had been part of this game, and all his decisions had become part of a much larger process. He was standing before a choice that would define his future and the future of those around him. "Are you ready?" the woman asked. Keanu looked at her, knowing that now he had to take a step forward. Everything that had happened before had led him to this decision. He nodded. Now Keanu knew that he was part of something much bigger. He understood that his actions could affect many lives. This was a moment that could become a turning point in his life and the lives of those connected to him. He was no longer alone, and now he had to find the strength to uncover the truth and change the future. "This is just the beginning," he said to himself as he left the building. But now his path was clear, and he knew that new challenges and decisions awaited him, which could lead him to the truth.